Wow, the curtains are closed. That means I should have been up here a long time ago. Good evening. Welcome to the National Archives. And on the behalf of the Archivist of the United States, David Ferriero, I'd like to welcome you to the National Archives. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the McGowan Theater and to your house here at NARA. There's a line from an old television series that said there are 8 million stories in the naked city. I didn't know about that. But I have to tell you, here at the National Archives, we have billions of stories. So if you ever wonder about what we have, we are the nation's, the federal agency, the federal government's record keepers. We have approximately 10 billion pages of textual records, 12 million maps, charts, photographs, and graphics. We've got 25 million aerial photographs, 3,000 reels of motion film, 4,000 video and sound recordings, and 133 terabytes of electronic data. And for perspective, you know, the terabyte thing, I have to keep up myself. Just so you know, there are about 1 million megabytes in a terabyte. So that just gives you a sense. So when you send that email that's got a big file that's 5 megabytes, just think about the archives. We have 133 terabytes of electronic records. We have slave ship manifests and the Emancipation Proclamation. We've got captured German records and the Japanese surrender documents from World War II. Journals from polar expeditions and photographs of Dust Bowl farmers. Indian treaties documenting the promises that weren't kept from many a nation, as well as immigration materials for those who made promises to the new nation called America. We've got the records for many, many, many generations of people who served in the armed services. And we've got locations all around the nation, from the presidential libraries and the federal record centers to our research and education sites in 17 states from coast to coast. We like to say that everyone can find themselves in the National Archives. So again, I say welcome to your house, the National Archives. So tonight in the theater, we have got a program, Lincoln and the Power of the Press, the War for Public Opinion. And since I didn't fully introduce myself, I'm Donna Garland. I'm actually the Chief of Strategy and Communication here at the National Archives, and the Media Relations and Press function for NARA is part of my office, so I am particularly excited about this program. There'll be a book signing following out in the lobby of the theater. We have, but before I get on with the program, I just want to tell you a little bit about the things that are going to be happening in NAR in the next couple of weeks, in case you're in town or want to come back to town to participate. So next week on Monday, October 27th at 7 p.m., we've got a program called Code Breaker. It includes a feature-length docudrama about the life of Alan Turing, the British mathematical genius who broke the German Enigma code during World War II. And my sister's actually a computer programmer and works for the Central Intelligence Agency. And when I said this, she said, "Oh yeah, I know that guy." I said, "Come on over. It's going to be a good show." So following the screening, Patrick Salmon, the film's executive producer, will have a discussion and talk about Alan and the film itself. Then following the next week, on Thursday, November 6th at 7 p.m. again, we'll present the program Congressional Drama, Midterm Election Analysis. And there's a lot of drama going on right now. We've got a bipartisan group of former members of Congress who will examine the November 4th midterm election. The panel will discuss the issues that brought voters out and some that didn't, the outcome of the polls, and the importance of voter participation in primary, as well as any surprises that happened during the course of the election. So if you want to hear some immediate feedback and some discussion of the election, please come back on November 6th. So to learn more about these and all of our other programs and exhibits, please look at the monthly calendar, which you probably saw out in the lobby, and if you didn't see one, you can see one on your way back out. We've got a sign-up sheet if you'd like to receive an email of the calendar itself right at your home. Another way to get involved is to become a member of the National Archives Foundation. And the foundation helps us do programs like we're seeing tonight, and they actually help support the development of this very theater. So if you're interested in becoming a member of the National Archives Foundation, you can see an application again in the lobby of this theater and also information in your program. So enough about the business of the National Archives. Let's talk about the business of tonight. It's my pleasure to introduce the two speakers that you'll hear from this evening. First, Harold Holzer, who is a leading authority on Lincoln and the Civil War. He's chairman of the Abraham Lincoln Bicentennial Foundation and the Roger Hertog Fellow at the New York Historical Society. Widely honored for his work, he has earned second place Lincoln Prize for Lincoln at Cooper Union in 2005, and in 2008 was awarded the National Humanities Medal. He is senior vice president at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Joining him will be Frank Bond. Frank has produced award-winning documentaries on topics ranging from the role of the press in the civil rights movement and the Berlin Wall, on issues like bias in the media, gosh, there's none of that, is there? To biographical sketches of key architects of modern journalism. Frank was a member of the team that created the Newseum's new museum gallery, which is down the street and across the street, an interactive look at the role of digital media in journalism today. So without further ado, I am delighted to yield the stage and the podium to our guests, Harold and Frank. Please join me in welcoming to the stage.
Good evening, and welcome, because tonight's program is going to prove to you that history can be as enticing and sizzling and dramatic as anything Netflix can serve up, even House of Cards. You just have to know where to find the stories and then how to tell them, and Harold certainly does that. In fact, Harold helped us at the Newseum with an upcoming exhibit, President Lincoln is Dead. The New York Herald reports the assassination. We may touch more on that later, but we're going to talk about President Lincoln and his dealings and workings with the press, with newspapers at the time. I think it's important to set the stage, Harold, by describing the landscape for the spread of news and information in the time of Lincoln. That's going to provide a context for really understanding the roles and practices of newspapers and their relations to politics and to the people. So first, the basic question, how was news moving in and out of Washington? And at that time, what had the biggest flow, from the capital out to the states or from the states into the capital?
Not surprisingly, from the East Coast out, and that held true for New York City and from Washington, D.C. Official newspapers of the administration existed for every presidential administration from Jefferson through Lincoln. Naturally, I haven't investigated past Lincoln, so I don't know, but their official newspapers carried the word in their editions, and then they were copied at first through the mail and then by telegraph, so the official information got to newspapers around the country. So definitely these were these two big East Coast centers of news. New York, by virtue of just being the media capital, and Washington, by virtue of being the capital, were the epicenters of news. And all things flowed from here.
So just to digest that, these newspapers would wear on their sleeve, we talk about bias in the media today, that I am a Democrat voice or I am a Republican voice. And how did that, in what sorts of issues did that just come to the fore and people knew which newspaper they were going to read and listen to?
It came to the fore in everything from election to dog catcher. I use that, the famous metaphorical example of a low-level elected official to President of the United States. Newspaper writing and editing and politics were completely intertwined during the Lincoln era, from the time Lincoln decided to become a politician in the 1830s through his presidency. And editors were politicians. Politicians were editors. We can talk later about Lincoln's brief foray as a newspaper publisher himself in Illinois, which is a pretty bizarre story. So the connections were just so deep. And added to that is the fact that people went around carrying a newspaper that's openly signaled their political affiliation, worn as proudly as, and I used to say, as we wear, meaning you and I don't know if anybody else does it, if it's not done today, but wore campaign buttons in our day, touting our support for one candidate or another. If you carried the New York Tribune under your arm in New York City in the 1850s, it was a given that you were a Republican and that you were anti-slavery. If you carried the New York Herald under your arm, it was a given that you were a Democrat and you didn't care much about the institution of slavery. And if you had to choose between union and slavery or business and slavery, slavery would always get the second level. People wore it proudly as they voted. Remember, people were not voting in a pure secret ballot condition in the Civil War era. People voted by streaming to the polls. See if people would be comfortable with this today when we cherish our secret ballot. When President Obama is trying to vote and people are saying, don't kiss my girlfriend or whatever that was about. But it was even more open and more raucous in the Lincoln era. You picked up your ballot before you got inside the polling place. And people offered you either a Republican ballot or a Democratic ballot, the blue ballot or the red ballot, or variations on the color theme. So everybody knew who you were going to vote for. And then you deposited the ballot typically in gigantic glass bowls. So besides which, you were carrying your newspaper around town for weeks before that, so people got it.
So at this point, the central government was becoming more powerful than ever in context of America. And by extension, I'm guessing this means that those newspapers were becoming more powerful as well.
Well, the central newspapers were becoming more powerful for several reasons. The Washington ones, because of course if you had official status from the administration, you got the inside scoop. You got the story first, you got the president's statement first, or down to the mayor of Washington's statement. By the way, the mayor of Washington, when Lincoln got to Congress, the mayor of Washington was the editor of the Whig paper. And that, this is not atypical in that period. The New York papers, the Tribune, the Herald, and later, beginning in 1851, the New York Times, had national editions. And these national editions circulated all over the country and made the Tribune and the Herald particularly very powerful national engines for political thought.
Let's talk about some of the men behind them, and let's start with Horace Greeley, who famously said, "Go west," but that wasn't until after the Civil War. But here's a newspaper man that was very much steeped in many of the issues of the day, whether it's encouraging women to pursue women's rights, abolition, that sort of thing. Tell me a little bit about Horace Greeley and the influence he had.
When I began this project, I really wanted to fall in love with Horace Greeley. I always had a secret desire to write a book just about Greeley. Unfortunately, as I progressed in the research and then in the writing, I realized that he was, I don't know how you put it, inconstant. He could not support an issue for more than 45 minutes without moving to the next issue. I don't know if it was like he had some sort of institutional ADD. He was a crusader, and he was a genius about promoting himself. I think abolition certainly was a key issue for him for the greater part of his life, but when you get to the Civil War era, he's willing to throw Lincoln in and cancel emancipation for peace in a weak moment. So Greeley, a total American original, he was as familiar to people by his appearance almost as Lincoln was when Lincoln became elected. He wore battered hats, he wore white linen coats that went down to his ankles. He would walk around New York City with his trousers in one boot, and then the other trouser leg was outside of the boot. Papers would be falling out of his pocket. He would wander from one side of the street to another. People would meet him in Manhattan and say, "Mr. Greeley, where are you off to?" And he wouldn't remember. Now, I don't know if it was an act or whether he was genuinely absent-minded. But in addition to women's rights, which was obviously very advanced, and abolition, which was dangerous when he began advocating it, he also was a big advocate of bran cereal, vegetarianism, spiritualism, utopian socialism. He lived in a house where there was no smoking, no drinking, no eating of meat. People would go out of there shocked about the environment in which he lived. But again, wildly popular, wildly influential. He had several moments in the Civil War where he buckled. After Bull Run, and as the 1864 re-election of Lincoln. 150 years ago, this month, I think Greeley was reliably supporting Abraham Lincoln, as any Republican editor would, but a month and a half before, he had gone off the reservation. I guess we can get to that later. So that's my Greeley summary, a character and sort of lovable. You know, it's one other, let me just add one other thing, not to belabor Greeley. I feel like I must apologize again for not loving Horace Greeley. He and Abraham Lincoln had so much in common. Both, as I point out at the beginning of the book, both began their adult journeys in the same year, in the same season, under the same circumstances, practically walking from their parents' home, or in Greeley's case, from his first job, to their each man's new headquarters in life, alone, on foot, allegedly both carrying all their belongings in a kerchief tied to a string. They were both born in log cabins. They both escaped or endured the deprivations of their youth through reading. Both just were wild for newspapers from an early age. And yet when they finally met, well, they met at a convention once, but then they met in Congress. They both served in Congress. Greeley was the Washington correspondent and the congressman at the same time, also typical. They just never hit it off. It was always something that kept them from being allies. And that was unusual for Lincoln because he courted newspaper men the way, well, I'll leave it at that. He courted newspaper.
There are two more characters I want you to describe a little bit, because I think these other characters really help to define Lincoln, help us to understand once we get to
I'll try
the
to
main
be
event.
briefer about the other
No, it's
guys.
okay. Henry Raymond of the New York Times and his connections to the Republican Party and to Abraham Lincoln.
Well, this is the typical politician editor of the mid-century period. He was a young man who loved newspapers as well, tried desperately to get Horace Greeley to notice him when Greeley was commuting to Albany, New York, our state capital. I mean, I'm a New Yorker, to put out a campaign newspaper, which he needed to provide money to sustain his newspaper in New York City. Greeley finally hired him for the New York Tribune, and Raymond was very talented, very hardworking, very dogged, very capable, and was soon the managing editor. But Greeley was a cheapskate, among his many other rare gifts. And Raymond just told him at one point, I can't take it anymore, and went off, joined another newspaper, ultimately got backing from the William Seward faction of Republican New York politics, and founded the New York Times in 1851. He was going to be less prone to faddish causes and distractions, more hewn to the party dogma than Horace Greeley. And Greeley was furious. He threatened newsboys, anyone who carries, and news dealers, anyone who carries the New York Times will not carry the Tribune. And then the newsboys all said, okay. And then he said, well, I didn't mean it exactly that way. Anyway, Raymond was Speaker of the New York State Assembly when he was managing editor of another paper in New York. He was a member of the Assembly and Lieutenant Governor of New York while he was editor of the New York Times. That beats even Greeley. And here's 150 years ago. If you were alive 150 years ago, you would have said Henry Raymond has done the hat trick. He is editor of the New York Times. He is chairman of the Republican National Committee. And he's running for Congress as a Republican from Manhattan in New York City. And just in his spare time, he writes a campaign biography of Abraham Lincoln, about 700 pages of Lincoln's speeches with commentary, which is the equivalent of campaign biographies were very important in the 1850s and 60s. So that's the equivalent of actually producing the television commercials for the candidate.
Sure. Yeah.
So that's all in a day's work for the editor of the New York Times. I found I admired Raymond a great deal. Greeley called him the little villain, and it was a nickname that stuck. Cartoonists portrayed him as a sort of a very little fellow with his big beard. But he stuck to it, and he made the New York Times, he committed the New York Times to the same idea of all the news that's fit to print that it still practices today. albeit under a different family ownership.
And finally, James Gordon Bennett of the New York Herald. That was the other powerful player. How did he fit into this whole scenario?
Well, we've done it in mixed up chron, but Bennett was the first on the scene, and he was the oldest. And born in Scotland before the turn of the 19th century, fell in love with newspapers, had a facility for language, so he got jobs as a translator of foreign news, and then ultimately wrote so many good things about the Andrew Jackson administration that he expected that Jackson and Jackson's successor, Martin Van Buren, would find a way to give him money to start his own newspaper. The administration didn't like him. You know, he's vaguely foreign, he's a little smarmy, and from that day on, Bennett is more independent than practically any newspaper editor in the country. Totally pro-democratic, racist, anti-Semitic, a little crazy, but an amazing self-promoter. He wrote about himself the way other reporters wrote about politicians, and he thought the world wanted to know about his comings and goings, his schedule, his romances. He founded the New York Herald as a penny newspaper, which is the equivalent of a raucous tabloid, and it became the most popular newspaper in the country. Probably would have been the most influential if it was strictly a Democratic Party paper or openly. He was very much a Democratic editor, but always said he hated all politicians. He hated the Pope. He hated the Archbishop of New York. He hated Lincoln. Liked Stephen A. Douglas for a while. Soured on him. He was a tough, canny operator, and listen, Greeley called Raymond a little villain, but Bennett got into duels and caning incidents on the street. He, walking on the steps of the New York Stock Exchange, a fellow publisher whacked him with a cane and knocked him down the steps. So Bennett gets up and rushes to put out a special edition to say that James Watson Webb did little but take one button out of his suit, and he still lives to do another edition. It was a raucous time. So these are the three dominant New York characters.
Sounds like Henry Raymond would have been on LinkedIn. Sounds like Greeley would have been Twitter. Right. And Bennett definitely would have been Facebook with the posts of, I just had a cheeseburger.
Exactly. That's very good.
So let's get to Lincoln.
I'm going to steal that and use it for the rest of my book tour.
Somewhere between chopping wood and reading by candlelight in his log cabin, Abraham Lincoln started to devour newspapers and really take an interest in how he could use them. How did this get started with him?
Well, newspapers were around, and it is true, sort of the yin and yang of Lincoln. We like to think of him reading the Bible and Shakespeare, but visitors and relatives described him also spreading out these gigantic broadsheet newspapers, much bigger than today's non-tabloid papers, and just devouring them and memorizing facts as he later memorized Shakespeare and biblical passages. When he became postmaster of New Salem, Illinois, that was the greatest job in the world for him, because people mailed newspapers all over the country in those days. It was much cheaper to mail a newspaper than it was to mail a letter. So that people, in fact, would write messages to people in their newspapers and keep in touch with their families by posting messages in the newspaper. So Congress, of course, took great umbrage at this. Rather than equalize the postage rates, they banned the use of special, this is a segue, but they banned the use of special messages in newspapers, so people got around it by circling letters and doing acrostics. This is how important newspapers were. So Lincoln gets to New Salem, and all of these subscribers who receive their newspapers are suddenly finding that they're arriving in non-pristine condition. They're opened and refolded, and then they sort of get the idea. And our new postmaster is reading our newspapers first. They get a kick out of it. It's amusing that he's reading every paper. And Lincoln soon becomes the official agent of the Sangamo Journal, which is a new newspaper that has been founded in Springfield, Illinois by ardent Whigs, Simeon Francis and his brothers, who became Lincoln's first newspaper sponsor. And Lincoln began feeding them editorials, anonymous editorials attacking Democrats. And when he decided finally to run for the state legislature, no surprise, the Sangamo Journal championed him as if he was a combination of Paul Bunyan and God. And the relationship existed for 30 years plus. Well, 30 years of Lincoln's life in Illinois. Sangamo Journal was his trusted organ, as they put it in those days. I mean, it doesn't sound entirely kosher to say that this newspaper was Lincoln's organ, but in those days it was accepted, that they understood that it was his tribune, it was his message, his messenger. Anything Lincoln wanted to communicate to the community was communicated through the Sangamo Journal, even more than in speeches, for which he became equally famous. So his political career became as one with his newspaper career. It's just not been written about as such.
So how would a politician, and specifically how did Lincoln, wrangle the newspaper to make sure that he was controlling his message? Because newspaper, they have a tendency, these journalists, to get a little independent. You know?
Yeah, well, politicians, again, it was a symbiotic relationship. They were friends, they were allies. But the control from a successful politician came in two ways. Government printing contracts. If your party had the legislative majority, you got the government printing contracts. Very lucrative. It was the difference between success or failure in the case of many of these weekly newspapers that, like the Sangamo Journal, that then became twice weekly and eventually daily. Better than that, when you got into positions of power, you could appoint the editors to some official position that would provide them additional income. So Stephen A. Douglas, Lincoln's arch rival in politics, has his own official organ in Springfield, the Illinois State Register. Its editor becomes a clerk in the state assembly, which is largely Democratic. And Douglas offers him jobs in when Buchanan is elected president, and they keep the patronage going back and forth. When Lincoln is elected president in 1860, an astonishing number of newspapermen got jobs as postmasters, and that was a big deal. Scripps, one of the co-editors of the Chicago Tribune, became postmaster of Chicago, which meant that he got to appoint about 100 other postmasters. Lincoln's favorite German editor became minister to Vienna, the diplomatic post. The joke was at the New York Tribune that so many managing and assistant editors were appointed to diplomatic posts that there would be nobody left to turn out the paper. So patronage and advertising, that was the control. And ideology, which they shared sincerely.
And so Lincoln understood the connection between the newspaper and its readership. And one of the stories I love is of a newspaper he purchased because he saw an opportunity there that had to do with votes.
It had to do with votes. It is a very strange story. In 1859, immigration became an issue in Boston, of all places. Started in Massachusetts. Democrats proposed a 2-year rule that hyphenated Americans would not be allowed to vote until they were in residence for 2 years. And it really was a strange thing to propose because the Democrats encouraged Irish immigration and favored Irish immigration because the Irish voted overwhelmingly Democratic. But the German immigrants voted overwhelmingly Republican. So bearing that in mind, Abraham Lincoln in 1859 learned that a German-born editor had recently moved his printing presses from southern Illinois to Springfield, Illinois, to start a new German-language Republican newspaper. But he got into financial trouble. We're not sure precisely what kind. And his printing presses and all his typesetting operations were confiscated, held in hock. Well, guess who came to the rescue? Abraham Lincoln did not attend a rally that this editor organized to protest the 2-year residency law, although he sent a letter a couple of days later. But he gave him $500 to get his printing press out of hock to start a new newspaper called the Illinois Staatsanzeiger, the Illinois State Advertiser, a weekly German-language paper. And Lincoln wrote the contract himself. I know the admonition that lawyers should not have themselves for clients, but Lincoln did. He couldn't spell the name of the editor, Theodore Canisius. He always spelled it incorrectly. But here's the contract he wrote. I will give you $500 to reclaim your apparatus. You will start a Republican newspaper. If it is conformable, that's the word Lincoln used, with the National Republican platform and the state Republican platform, then after the end of 1860, that's an interesting date, after the presidential election, you can have it all. You can have the typesetting, you can have the printing press, no charge, no repayment, no interest. That's all you have to do. And that's all he did. The sad thing is not one copy of this paper exists in Illinois. No one's been able to find one. But we know from the reports in the daily English language paper that those who could speak German said that the paper was totally pro-Lincoln in 1860. So why was this important? Why would Lincoln buy a newspaper printed in a language, by the way, that he didn't understand? He had taken German lessons in Springfield with a group of friends, but apparently he was such a wisecracker in the class that no one learned anything, and they disbanded the class. I should circle back. I didn't answer the main thing you asked. Why was this important? Because Germans were migrating westward. Illinois had been Democratic. If enough Germans moved to Illinois, read this Republican paper, got into a hullabaloo spirit to elect Republicans, aka elect Abraham Lincoln, the state could be turned Republican. Same was true in Indiana, in Iowa, in Missouri. German registration increasing, and the voting bloc and states going from what we would call red to blue. So Lincoln was aware of that, never understood a word of the paper, relied on people to assure him that it was, quote, conformable, unquote. So that was Lincoln's. By the way, people were really open about being editors and politicians at the same time. Lincoln must have had a little bit of a problem with it, because he's just about the only guy I found in this entire era who wouldn't tell anybody about the crossover. He kept it a secret. His banker knew. One of his cronies in politics knew and said, don't invest in this guy, Canisius, he's a leech. Lincoln ignored him. Canisius knew, but apparently nobody else knew. Didn't want it to be known.
Well, let's stay right there for a moment, because everything you've described is specifically the sorts of things we've tried to stay away from in terms of the relationship between the free press, one of the tools of self-governance, and our elected officials. And yet, we've got a growing country, we've got a country on the move, and apparently it did not descend into chaos because of these practices, or did it?
You know, in 1860, amidst this chaotic, certainly cacophonous newspaper culture, 80% of eligible voters went to the polls. Now, admittedly, it's 80% of white men, the only people who are eligible, but it's 80%. Maybe the wildness of the culture was kind of irresistible and magnetic. That's one of the things I speculate about a bit. But Abraham Lincoln probably would agree with you in one way when he became president, and there was an unprecedented rebellion at hand and a war to be fought, he suddenly became a lot less tolerant of the clamor and the raucousness and the independence. But that's another story I'm sure you want to get to.
And we are going to get to that. I want to make one more little side road here, because the third rail of news and information in politics is always technology. And all this was going on when we had the telegraph coming into play, we had photography, and we had the railroad. Put those three together, what impact did that have on what newspapers could now do?
Well, let's take photography out of the equation, sadly, because no one had figured out a way to publish photographs in newspapers. Photographs and artist sketches, certainly artist correspondence sketches during the Civil War, would be engraved very quickly in soft wood and made into woodcuts. But they didn't quite have that process in hand. Certainly, the telegraph revolutionized news reporting. News that had taken a week or a week and a half to amble west through the U.S. mails, which were not overnight, and made newspapers truly current, truly daily bastions of news, and that was unheard of at that time. The railroad brought the newspapers of New York, west, south, and north. I found this wonderful line, and of course, as a New Yorker, I took special pride in it, that someone said, all of New York's newspapers seem to flow out to other cities, but no other newspapers come into New York. I find that completely unsurprising, but they were surprised. One more technological thing I would add to your mix, and that's the printing press. You know, no more of this, no more of the hand-cranked Peter Zenger operations. The whole lightning press made it possible to rush, you know, hundreds of impressions every minute. And that's why the New York Herald was able to reach a circulation of 100,000 during the Civil War. So the printing press added to that. In fact, both Bennett and Greeley talk about the fact that the most assuring moment of their day always came, even though they usually sat on the top floor of their 4 or 5 story buildings, when that hum started in the basement, and that was the printing presses starting, meaning that the first rounds of the newspaper were rolling off the presses at 2 or 3 in the morning.
I take your point about photography. I love photography of the era because Lincoln himself said that Brady portrait that we see on the old $5 bill won him the presidency.
No, it was the Cooper Union.
Cooper Union.
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
That's all right.
You're right. And Brady, when we got into the Civil War, giving the imagery. So they existed side by side. You're right. It was not a part and parcel to the newspaper themselves. They were still going through the cuts.
But the New York Times writes a really seminal piece in 1862 when Alexander Gardner's battlefield photographs of Antietam go on view in New York, and they say the war has been brought to our doorstep because people were now finding ways to see the images. Again, the symbiotic relationship. If you don't know that this gallery has Gardner's brutal and devastating photographs of dead bodies, the newspaper will tell you, and there will be a long line outside of that gallery because of that review.
The Civil War begins. I think, especially being in this town, we have to remember that the Battle of Bull Run, something that people went as spectators. We have a situation where Julia Ward Howe wrote the lyrics to the Battle Hymn of the Republic in her room at the Willard Hotel, looking out at the campfires and everything. And even at that point, I don't think Abraham Lincoln realized what was about to happen. But let's go into what you were saying about the unprecedented actions that he took against press freedom in terms of censorship as the nation descends into war.
Yeah, it's an extraordinary story because most people have acknowledged that the freedom of the press was challenged during the Civil War, North as well as South, but have focused on some of the most spectacular of the cases, understandably. The closing of the Chicago Times in 1863 by General Burnside, and the closing of the New York World and another pro-democratic paper by Lincoln's order in 1864. But I found, as I assembled my notes to make this book as chronological as I could, that press suppression began in 1861 and continued all through the war in not surprising places and shocking places. It began right after Bull Run, when Abraham Lincoln issued a call for volunteers. Newspapers that editorialized against joining the army. Newspapers that suggested that the Battle of Bull Run had been a humiliation for the North, a humiliation for American troops, felt the brunt of the first wave of suppression. It was disorganized at the beginning. The post office, the Postmaster General said, don't let those newspapers be mailed. The Secretary of State said, let's not allow this editor to be at liberty. Arrest him without charge. The Army in the border states that were teetering on the brink of secession, Baltimore, Maryland, particularly in Baltimore, shut down newspapers. So the Army, the State Department, the Post Office Department. And then the justice system. A grand jury in New York City issued what amounted to a subpoena suggesting that 8 or 9 newspapers be shut down immediately because they had argued against joining the military. And this, in turn, inspired mobs to attack newspapers in New England, in Massachusetts, in Rhode Island, in Maine. You can't get much more north and out of the danger of secession than Maine. And it continues all through the war, Indiana, Illinois. As you go deeper into the war, there are limits, probably much more understandable limits, on giving away Army positions, military secrets. So generals are almost always develop an extreme mistrust of journalists in their midst. And to their credit, to their enormous credit, journalists are out there at the front, determined to gather news, determined to bring stories to the public. Eventually, right here in Washington, the War Department sets up, moves the military telegraph to its own library, right next to the Secretary of War's office. So all the journalists have to bring their stories to the War Department to get sanctioned. My friend Craig Simons, who's here tonight, and I wrote a story about Henry Raymond, the editor of the New York Times, who actually covered the Battle of Bull Run himself and sent word via a runner, probably horseback runner, the Union has won. You know, the early part of the battle was a Union victory. And that was transmitted, and the first editions of the New York Times said that the Battle of Bull Run had been a Union success. Well, then Raymond understands that the tide turns and the South has won the battle. But he can't find anybody to transmit the message. Nobody's around. There's such chaos. So he straggles back to Washington along with the defeated Army of the Potomac and goes to file his story that this has been a tragic loss for the Union. And the telegraph operator says, well, that doesn't sound like a very positive story. I don't think that's a very good story to transmit. It took the New York Times days while other newspapers in New York were saying that, that this had happened. So that was a lesson Raymond learned. So it was a very complex, confusing time. Was there justification for it? Probably some. Certainly if reports are true that General Lee plotted his invasion of Pennsylvania in 1863 by reading about Union troop positions in the Philadelphia newspapers. It's not helpful. But did it go over the line? Probably.
And what sorts of attempts did newspapers make to fight back? How could they resist the power of the presidency?
Most didn't. There were some miraculous conversions. Right after Fort Sumter, every newspaper in New York City flew an American flag. James Gordon Bennett's New York Herald noticeably did not, which instigated a mob to gather outside of the office of the New York Herald, yelling and chanting and screaming, and then people observed this young boy, an employee of the newspaper, racing out the door. About 10 minutes later, he came back with a flag under his arm. Miraculously. About 2 minutes later, a flag is unfurled from the window, and the crowd was rather disappointed that it couldn't burn down the paper. Dissipated. There were opportunities to strike back or to argue back. The House of Representatives held a major hearing about telegraph suppression here in Washington in late 1861 and late 1862. They got very sidetracked by a side story. You wouldn't believe this about a congressional committee, I know. They got sidetracked by a report that the president's first annual message, or State of the Union message as we call it today, had been leaked to the New York Herald, maybe by the First Lady of the United States, and maybe in return for money. That was a pretty tough story. They never quite surfaced it. They spoke around it, but it was diverting enough that the major issue of the hearing, which is whether telegraphic censorship was abusive or in fact absurd, never quite never quite got heard, and no legislation was ever passed. After the New York World was shut down in 1864, Horace Greeley, our friend the Crusader, organized a committee of fellow editors, about 15 of them. Henry Raymond, of course, would not join because he's an organization man, and issued sort of a Bill of Rights for journalists. But even the Bill of Rights, saying the government has no real right to oversee what we do. But they said in this manifesto, as they called it, that newspapers are not allowed to support the enemy and not allowed to criticize the Emancipation Proclamation and not allowed to discourage the draft or enlistment. So the newspapers themselves were surprisingly not very critical of the policy, especially among Republican, aka liberal editors, when their Democratic rivals were being shut down and put out of business. They sort of liked that.
Certainly, the Civil War dominates the news. What else was in the newspapers during these war years? I mean, once again, we're coming from a climate where, as we talked about earlier, the people really are listening to the voice of the newspaper of their choice, Democrat or Republican. Right. They're really relying on that, if you will, in their daily lives. So what else is in the pages of that newspaper besides what's going on in the war?
That's a great question, because the war dominates historians' observations of the newspapers of the period. But of course, every newspaper has to have local news, crime news. In New York, financial news. And New York editors prided themselves, as did before the blockade, Southern Atlantic Coast newspapers prided themselves in getting access to foreign news quickly because they had harbors that received ships with foreign news. In fact, the competition for foreign news, even during the Civil War, was so intense that when a ship approached, newspapers would send little ships of their own out to meet the ship so they could get the news before the ships docked. That was how intense the competition was. But I would say if there was one thing, one subject that almost equaled the war in intensity of coverage, it was politics. Politics, politics, politics. Local, state, and national politics. There was not just an election every November 4th. There were elections all the time in the United States. There were October state elections. There were September local elections. There were November elections. There were winter elections. And it kept people perpetually interested in casting ballots, making their voices heard, listening to rallies, and reading what politicians were saying at campaign appearances around their vicinity and around the country.
You have to say, I have to guess that Lincoln would have been a heck of an editor, that he could fit the Gettysburg Address on the back of an envelope, right? So let's start there. But in the 1864 election, he had his hands full because both Greeley and Raymond were trying to jostle him off the top of the ticket. How did that play out?
It was a very tough year. I mean, Raymond is chairman of the Republican National Committee, called the Union National Committee because the Republicans decided to adopt a more universal name for the party, not to seem as partisan, just to be sort of a pro-union, pro-war party. And Lincoln is nominated early, although Horace Greeley has done everything he can to deny him renomination. Greeley suggests and promotes a series of alternatives, from Ulysses S. Grant to other generals to John Charles Fremont, who is no longer an active general, supports a Fremont third party candidacy. Greeley encourages Treasury Secretary Salmon Chase to run against his boss, comes down to Washington, visits Chase, and says, if I could make a perfect candidate, it would be you. This puffs up Chase and causes his ruin eventually. Lincoln gets the nomination. I mean, it's a story in its own, but he gets the nomination in June. But it's not over as far as Greeley is concerned. Greeley continues to promote third-party alternatives. And then in the summer, when things are looking really desperate for Republicans, Greeley does the most extraordinary thing that I think he ever did as a newspaper / politician / zealot. He decides, after years of advocating freedom, that the time had come, because the country was so bleeding and bankrupt, as he put it in a letter to Lincoln, that it was time to make peace with the Confederacy, to let them go, or to woo them back to the Union by canceling the Emancipation Proclamation, or at least putting it back on the table. There are peace delegates in Niagara Falls, Greeley tells Lincoln. You ought to invite them to Washington and find a way to make a truce that will end the bloodshed, even if it means, there's no emancipation. We'll call a convention of the states and try to figure this thing out, because we know we can speak in soft voices and without guns. Lincoln is appalled, obviously, and worried. But he's so brilliant politically, whether he would have been brilliant as an editor, I suspect you're right. He says to Greeley, no, I don't want these guys to come down here to Washington. I'm paraphrasing. Why don't you go up to Niagara Falls and you engage them in peace talks, and if you get a feeler for peace, let me know. So Greeley, who claims he doesn't want to do it himself, gets even more puffed up. And he goes up to Canada, Niagara Falls, Canada. But as he gets there and is prepared to start these talks, he gets a surprise. He gets a visit from President Lincoln's assistant private secretary, John Hay, who's also sort of his press secretary, and has continued to write newspaper articles himself all through the war. And Hay brings Greeley a letter from Abraham Lincoln. Here are the terms that I will accept. The rebellion is to end, the primacy of the Union is to be recognized, and emancipation is to be upheld. Greeley has no choice but to show the delegates this letter. The delegates say, this is an outrage. How dare you come up here and waste our time? The peace talks collapse. Greeley goes back to New York in abject humiliation and real fury. He's decided he's going to get Lincoln no matter what. And decides, let's publish all the correspondence that he's had with the president, the private correspondence. So Lincoln sends a quick letter to Henry Raymond, the editor of the Times, and says, Greeley wants to publish these letters. I will accept that, but here's what I'm crossing out. And he actually uses red ink to cross things out. Okay, switch to Henry Raymond for a moment. All of a sudden, Henry Raymond, the chairman of the RNC, goes off the reservation. And he writes a letter to Lincoln saying, everyone says you can't win. Maybe you should hold a peace conference. Maybe you should put emancipation back on the table. So now the two most important Republican editors in the country are telling him to abrogate emancipation, cancel freedom, or at least make it a negotiating chip. Lincoln has always been able to control Raymond through personal persuasion and by force of personality. He never tries it with Greeley, or at least he knows it doesn't work from his congressional days. Calls Raymond to Washington with the entire National Committee, puts his big hand on Raymond's shoulder, I imagine. Raymond's about 5'1". That hand comes crashing down on his shoulder and saying, I think it's better that we lose and favor freedom than that we win and cancel freedom. And as he later put it, if I should cancel freedom after African Americans have fought for their own freedom in our ranks, I should be damned in time and eternity. Raymond gets very excited. We're going to win this somehow. We're going to go back. He's energized. He goes back to New York. And that one little moment of Raymond's feeling it was over never happens again. And then a few days later, William T. Sherman occupies Atlanta. And suddenly, even without public opinion polls or daily briefings on where we are with elections, everyone feels that the wind is at Lincoln's back and that he will succeed. And everything turns and there's great enthusiasm. Horace Greeley, 2 or 3 weeks after Sherman takes Atlanta and completely changes the momentum of that campaign, he sends a letter to every Republican governor in the country saying, don't you think it's time that we have a new national convention and choose a different nominee than President Lincoln? So that was the final interplay between Horace Greeley and Abraham Lincoln. After that, Lincoln completely wrote him off. As he said to members of his cabinet, he's like an old shoe that can't be repaired. And they said, what do you mean by that? He said, you know, when we lived on the frontier, we would have shoes that were sewn to the sole. And when they wore out, our mothers would just move them a little bit and then sew them again and make new holes, and then maybe move them forward third time out. But when they rotted at the bottom and there was no place to put a thread to bind them to you, we finally discarded them. And that's what Greeley is to me, an old shoe who can't be repaired. And he never spoke to him again, never really wrote to him again, never handled his constant patronage requests again. Raymond was very, very happy man after that. Because he got to choose all the New York federal appointments, or many of them, after Lincoln won re-election.
I want to invite our audience to get in on the questioning. We have microphones on either side of the room, and if you do have a question, I'd ask you to go to one of the microphones. In the meantime, we're going to keep talking. What was his biggest strength, Abraham Lincoln, his understanding of the press or of the politics?
I can't answer the question because there was no difference between the press and politics. How about his understanding? He understood that the game involved both, and he knew how to play. He knew how to play politics in terms of what I hate the expression. My wife and I always talk about how we hate the expression of retail politics. So I know it's in currency today, but he could make a heck of a speech. His appearance moved people. He could walk among people and excite them, but behind the scenes, pulling the strings of newspaper editors, offering them influence, advertising, jobs, a say in policy. It was very powerful. And when that didn't work, he had one other way of approaching newspapers, and that's sort of to go above editors' heads with masterful, what we call public letters. There are at least 5 of them during his administration that stand out in history as extraordinary moments in American press history, because Lincoln writes a letter to an editor or to a colleague that gets printed in papers around the country. And it's almost like fireside chats became in FDR's time, or the magnetism of President Kennedy's first news conferences, which of course I was too young to observe myself, but I heard about. So in all those ways, politician and press puppeteer, he was both.
Good. Let's go to our first audience question. If you could tell us your name and then fire away.
Kim Holian, retired Army historian. I'm here with Lincoln at the Crossroads Alliance. Could you go into a little bit more detail about the impact of the First Battle of Bull Run and Lincoln in the press?
Of course. Well, Bull Run, aside from being a comeuppance for Union military aspirations and pride, or American military aspirations and pride, was a wake-up call to journalists, both in terms of being under fire, and there were journalists who had never been under fire, although there were others who had covered the Crimea and covered the Mexican War, but this was different. One journalist was so famished that he began eating berries off a tree during a skirmish, and then some shot was scattered around the area, and all the berries came pounding down on him. He realized that was a slightly different experience than he had been used to. But it was also an experience of awareness of the limits of freedom of the press. William Howard Russell of the London Times was probably the greatest victim or the greatest perpetrator, or both, of that occurrence. Russell, who was the most famous war correspondent in the world, was sent here by the London Times to cover the American troubles, and very grandly went out to Bull Run, rented a handsome carriage, and when he came back, wrote about complete disorganization of the Union Army, cowardice by some of the troops, and very bad decisions by officers. Russell was so hounded by the War Department and so abandoned by Lincoln, who had met him a few weeks before Bull Run and said, "Mr. Russell, I'm so glad to meet you. I reckon the London Times is as powerful as anything on earth except maybe the Mississippi River." Now he conspired with the War Department in denying him access to the front in an effort to get rid of him as the London correspondent. Convinced, I think, that Russell was pro-South, or at least pro-recognition of the Confederacy by England. So Bull Run, again, it changes everything. Raymond comes back to Washington and finds that there's censorship at the telegraph office. And Winfield Scott, who has already imposed telegraph censorship, hardens it, toughens it. So it's the beginning of the free reporting of the war and the end of the free reporting of the war. And it all happens just so amazingly close to Washington.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sure.
Let's go to this side. Hello.
Hi, John Elliff from the Lincoln Group of D.C. We're going to be having a symposium on the 1864 election on November 8th, the anniversary of Lincoln's reelection. My question is about the election. In 1864, that election year, what was done to suppress the Copperhead and peace movement press during that election year?
Good question, John. What I find amazing about the suppression issue in 1864 is not that there were incidents of shutdowns, which there were, but how Lincoln moves away from that as the campaign progresses. And even though the New York World is shut down in 1864 for a reason that had, remarkably enough, or ironically enough, had nothing to do with politics. It had to do with the World's publishing a bogus presidential proclamation on enlistment and the draft, which the administration was furious about because they were actually working on such a proclamation. In fact, it was a complete invention of yet another journalist who was hoping the stock market would plummet as a result of this news, and that he would then buy in and the market would recover and he'd retire from the newspaper business completely. But after the New York World is sort of cleared of wrongdoing, at least in perpetrating the bogus proclamation, its editor, Manton Marble, typical of a Copperhead editor, goes on to absolutely decimate Abraham Lincoln throughout the 1864 campaign. Triggers in Lincoln the only probably angry letter to an editor that he wrote in his entire political life, because the New York World kept repeating the calumny that 2 years earlier, when Lincoln had visited the Antietam battlefield, he had strolled among the dead and wounded and asked his aide, Ward Hill Lamon, to sing a comic song, a sign of complete disrespect and contempt for the sacrifices of the troops. Lincoln let it lie for a while, and then he called Lamon in and dictated this letter, or wrote the letter out, asked Lamon to sign it, send it to the papers, and then said, no, take it back. Let's not send it. If people are not convinced that I have enough character not to have done that, then I don't deserve their support. And he let the world get away with murder in 1864. Lincoln believed, I think sincerely, that newspapers that crossed the line and gave, this is a very loose term, but gave aid and comfort to the enemy were deserving of close watching and perhaps suppression, perhaps even the arrest and imprisonment without trial of newspapermen. He authorized it or tolerated it many times. But he believed also that there was something sacred about elections, about free elections. Why else allow a free election in the midst of civil war? And once he committed to that free election, he committed to freedom of the press. And I think that famous speech he made from the balcony of the White House saying if we did not have a free election, we might as well have said that the rebels have beaten us in advance. I think implied in that is he meant a free press during the campaign as well.
Thank you. Let's go back over here. Yes, sir.
Mr. Holzer, I have a Lincoln question for you. I don't expect that you cover it in this book, but one doesn't every day have the chance to be in the same room with the world's leading authority on Lincoln, so here it goes.
Amen.
This was the subject of an article in the New York Times in the last year or two, but what do you know about Lincoln's relationship with his father and his stepmother. It seems that they lived for a long time, that they survived him, at least that his stepmother did, but he
His
doesn't seem to have had anything to, or doesn't seem to have seen them for a long time, or had much to do with them.
Yeah, in those days, once you left home, you left home. So we shouldn't judge him too harshly for distancing himself from his roots when he became an adult. But of course, he had an extremely complicated relationship with his father, who did nothing to encourage his aspirations to learn, and who, in fact, discouraged them. Little sympathy for Thomas Lincoln, who could barely read himself. You know, farmers had tried to have lots of children in those days because they needed their sons to help them on the farm. And Thomas had one son, Abraham. And I guess when Abraham said he's really not terribly interested in helping, it wasn't great news for Thomas Lincoln. And I imagine that Thomas was as disappointed in his son for not caring about supporting him as Lincoln was disappointed in his father for not understanding his quest for learning and advancement. Did he hit him? Did he beat him? Some people attested to the fact that he used the lash and corporal punishment, which wouldn't have made him that unusual either. I suspect that when Lincoln got, to be a head taller than his father, that stopped. But no great love. And we know that because when his father was dying in the 1850s, his stepmother's son wrote to Lincoln and said, "You must come, father is fading." And Lincoln wrote a letter, a mysterious letter saying, "I think it would cause more pain than comfort if I were to come now." So clearly there was a great rift that was unhealed and unhealable, even at the time of Thomas's death. Briefly about his stepmother, I think that the two most important and most fortunate relationships Lincoln had in his life, and the two luckiest days of his life, are when the stepmother arrived at their log cabin and when he met Mary Lincoln, Mary Todd. We'll get into Mary Todd later because you didn't ask about her, and someone always does. But this woman comes with furniture and books into their lives, finds these ragged, wild children who had been abandoned, young children abandoned in their cabin, while Thomas went off to the big city to see if he could find another wife, a widow woman who had cast her lot with him and his children. And she brought brothers and sisters and books and fancy furniture, and it instantly took to this unusual young man. Loved him as much or more than her own son, protected, nurtured, encouraged him. Is one of my sources that Lincoln read newspapers at an early age, so I'm grateful to her for that myself, in an interview with Lincoln's law partner. And Lincoln absolutely adored her. And they met very touchingly for the last time after Lincoln was finished composing his first inaugural address. He paid a visit to his mother to say goodbye, to his stepmother. So he did go back when his father was out of the picture. And she held on to him and said, I know they're going to kill you. And they separated and hugged and embraced, but she had that premonition. And they said that when the cousins arrived at her cabin in April 1865 to tell her that, in fact, he had died, that she wasn't even surprised. And she had shed her tears at his parting from Illinois. He did try to help her during his presidency. There's this letter that his cousin Dennis Hanks writes, just what Lincoln needed in the midst of the Civil War. He gets a letter saying, that $50 you sent from Mother has been misspent and misappropriated. So I imagine he sent money to her repeatedly and probably was never convinced that it was being put to use for her. So it was difficult, but great love.
Thank you.
Because Mary encouraged, elevated him, just as his stepmother had. encouraged him, made him believe in himself, and shared with him, "Go Mary," a love of newspapers. Their love was founded on newspapers. After they had their terrible separation on the fatal, what is called the fatal 1st of January, 1841, when Lincoln broke off their engagement. Now that was just a relationship based on physical attraction and love of poetry. They got together for a much more important reason, newspapers. Mary and Abraham had been busy writing these very caustic, anonymous letters for the Springfield paper, torturing and teasing an Irish-American office holder named James Shields. And Shields stormed into the office of the Sangamo Journal and demanded to know who is the author of these letters. Well, one of the most recent ones had been written by young Mary Todd. So the editor called Lincoln and said, "Well, what do we do here?" And Lincoln said, "Tell him that I am the author." Very heroic. Mary was very impressed. And Shields was not impressed. He challenged Lincoln to a duel. And they went out to an island, technically part of Missouri, where dueling was legal, called Bloody Island. And they were going to have a duel. Now, Lincoln, as the person who was challenged, got the choice of weapons, so he chose broadswords. You know, he had the longest arms in Sangamo County. So the duel was aborted and the problems were forgotten. Lincoln returned in one piece to Springfield, and very few weeks later, Abraham and Mary were married. Thanks to newspapers, as I said. All things lead to the press.
Yes, sir.
Good evening, Harold. David Gerlman with the Papers of Abraham Lincoln. My question is, Lincoln's wiliness in the election of 1864, dangling possible cabinet positions, Greeley as Postmaster General, Bennett perhaps as Minister to France, if you'd like to speak to those.
Sure. I didn't dwell much on the Postmaster Generalship for Greeley because I really don't think there's any evidence that it could have happened, that they could have been in the same room even after Niagara Falls. But the flirtation with James Gordon Bennett was extraordinary. Lincoln had made an effort to neutralize James Gordon Bennett in 1860. He had an emissary from Illinois politics visit him in New York, and Bennett said, "Oh, you know, I don't think he's a bad guy, but I think he has terrible people around him, and the first time that there is a fugitive slave that he has to catch, they'll all be all over him, and he'll be a radical, and I'm not going to be for him." And he wasn't for him. And in 1864, Lincoln again wanted to neutralize Bennett, the most powerful newspaper man and the most widely read newspaper in the country, not just in New York, but again in that national edition. And reprints. It's another thing worth mentioning, that things printed in the Herald were reprinted everywhere. Things printed in the Times and the Tribune, etc. So yes, I think he did dangle what we would call the ambassadorship to France to Bennett in total secrecy. Bennett, what's strange is that some historians contended over the years that the New York Herald supported Abraham Lincoln. It did not support Abraham Lincoln. The editorials through practically Election Day 1864 are anti-Lincoln, but they're also a little bit anti-McClellan. A pox on both their houses. It's a bad choice. It's a terrible choice we have. And that was enough for Lincoln, because astonishingly enough, after the election, he officially invites this character who he won't even invite to the White House. He never wants him in the White House. He is such a social pariah that he's not welcome in any dignified circles, especially the most important house in the United States. He does offer him the job, and Bennett very grandly says, I can't accept it at my age. It would be too much for me, and I could be of much more use here. Probably Lincoln would have loved the idea of getting rid of him and getting him to Europe so that he could proceed with Reconstruction without James Gordon Bennett. But if it was the deal of the century for support, the support didn't come. It just lessened the vitriol for a while and increased the criticism of George McClellan. It absolutely killed McClellan in New York, which was a vital state. And Lincoln barely won New York second time around.
Thank you. We have a question over here. Yes, sir.
John Swallow, Lincoln Group at DC. You described a lot editors being in politics, et cetera. Did this extend to the southern states who seceded, and so there was maybe congressmen in the CSA who were also editors, and who else besides Lincoln was really good at playing the press as well as, Jefferson Davis probably not, for example.
Definitely not. Didn't like it as much as Lincoln did. Didn't come from a background that included parrying with journalists and composing articles for journals. But yeah, Robert Barnwell Rhett was a newspaper man. The Charleston Mercury man became a political leader. It was a common thing, north as well as south. Obviously, my book doesn't focus too much on the Confederate side because I try to keep the spotlight on Lincoln. It's such a gigantic story. And I'd like to do work on the Southern press in the Civil War. My friend Mark Neely has done some very good work on censorship and suppression in the Confederacy, which was even more rampant than it was in the Union. But the idea of the crossovers between editors and politicians was a national, not a regional phenomenon.
And the Congress of the United States would maybe have 10, 15, 20 editors?
Sure. And if you weren't a member, you were an official of the body. John Wayne Forney, who's one of my favorite characters that I wrote about in the book, who was a Philadelphia editor who gets bored with Philadelphia, so he moves to Washington and starts a Sunday paper and called the Sunday Chronicle, and then expands it into a daily paper called the Washington Daily Chronicle, which becomes Lincoln's favorite paper. I think it's the one he poses with on the cover of the book at a photography gallery. Forney is the clerk of the House of Representatives, but he loses the job in the transition to the Lincoln administration. So Forney and Lincoln meet. No one knows exactly what they said or what they offered each other. But a few days later, Lincoln is calling in the new senator from Illinois, who has replaced the late Stephen A. Douglas, and saying, this guy Forney ought to be Secretary of the Senate, which is a very high-paying patronage job, and which also keeps Forney in the legislative hall so he can report back to Lincoln. And Lincoln really strong-armed Orville Browning, the new senator. Browning writes in his diary, I don't know who this Forney is, but I guess I'm going to support him because the president really wants him. Forney becomes Secretary of the Senate and is very tight with Lincoln for the remainder of the Civil War.
Thank you. This looks like our final question over here. No?
This highly partisan press, and I'm talking about before the censorship of the Civil
Yes.
War. The highly partisan press, how good or bad was it on actually conveying news? I mean, if you read a newspaper every day, did you know what was going on, or were you just filled with partisan fiction?
A visitor from Europe commented that he read a report of the same event in a Democratic and a Whig paper, and it was impossible to know which description to believe because they were totally different. So the idea of news reporting suffered, but the audience didn't seem to mind. They relished the partisan filter through which even ordinary news was pushed. So the answer is, if you were a Democrat and you read a story about how foolish the Republicans had been at a rally and how they embarrassed themselves, I guess you accepted that as gospel news.
Good. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Hello, my name is Barry Meisenberg. I'm an amateur. I'm a grateful amateur, though. The question I wanted to ask you was about the larger question about Lincoln and popular opinion. You've described him making an effort to manipulate public opinion, but in what I've read of him, I also get the sense that he was molded by public opinion and pushed along his journey by the public opinion. There's a description in Foner's book, I think, of him reading all these papers and receiving hundreds of letters. And what is your sense of that question?
My view has always been that one of the most disingenuous things Abraham Lincoln ever said, and it's been adopted by so many generations of historians, unconvincingly, at least to me, is that I claim not to have controlled events, but that events have controlled me. Lincoln liked to convey the impression that he was being pushed along by popular opinion, while at the same time doing more to influence public opinion than any president before him and many afterwards. And you see the true admission, the less disingenuous admission in the Lincoln-Douglas debates when he says, he who molds public opinion is more important than he who enacts statutes. I think Lincoln really believed that, and he believed that the public opinion came first and the statutes would come later. And I think he was an active molder, certainly tester of and molder of public opinion in just an absolutely remarkable way.
Thank you. Harold Holzer, thank you so much for your insight and a wonderful book, a wonderful read. You're going to be signing copies of this right outside, right after this program. Thank you all, not only for coming tonight, but for bringing such terrific questions. And it's been a real pleasure to spend time with you.
Thanks. Thank you.